It was an ordinary afternoon in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other's routines and life moved slowly. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the well-kept lawns and the rows of similar houses. Birds chirped from the trees and children's laughter echoed from a nearby park. Everything seemed peaceful, almost perfect. But underneath that calm surface, tensions had been quietly building for weeks. The protagonist had always tried to live peacefully, respecting neighbors' space and rules. They were friendly, polite, and willing to lend a hand when needed. But living next to Karen was a different challenge. Karen was known in the neighborhood for her fiery temper and her need to control everything around her. She had a sharp voice and a sharp tongue to match, and she rarely thought twice before criticizing someone or escalating minor disagreements into loud arguments. Over time, her actions had begun to wear on the protagonist, testing their patience in ways they never imagined. On this particular afternoon, the protagonist was in the middle of some light yard work. They were trimming the bushes along the fence line, humming softly to themselves, enjoying the calm. The gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and for a moment everything felt right. That peace was short-lived. Karen appeared suddenly, striding down the driveway with a scowl that seemed permanently etched on her face. She didn't greet the protagonist or exchange pleasantries. Instead, she pointed an accusing finger at the neatly trimmed bushes and began her verbal assault. Her voice was loud and cutting, drawing the attention of nearby neighbors. She complained about the shape of the bushes, saying they weren't aligned perfectly and that the yard looked messy. Her criticism was exaggerated and unnecessary, but Karen had a way of making even small issues seem catastrophic. The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. They had learned over time that responding with anger often made things worse. They politely explained that they were in the middle of trimming and would finish soon. But Karen was relentless. She refused to listen and continued shouting, her words sharp and harsh. Her tone made it clear that she expected immediate obedience and total agreement with her opinions. Other neighbors began to peek from their windows and doorways, curious about the commotion. Some shook their heads, recognizing the familiar pattern of Karen's outbursts. A few had experienced similar confrontations themselves, and they could see the frustration building in the protagonist. The tension in the air was palpable, and it felt as though a storm was brewing. Karen's yelling escalated further, moving from complaints about the yard to personal attacks. She criticized the protagonist's lifestyle, questioning their choices and belittling their efforts. Each word seemed designed to sting, and the protagonist felt a mix of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief. They had never imagined that a simple act of maintaining their yard could turn into such an aggressive confrontation. Despite the pressure, the protagonist tried to stay composed. They reminded themselves that reacting impulsively would only give Karen more power over the situation. They kept their voice steady, responding calmly and clearly, attempting to de-escalate the argument. But Karen was not interested in a conversation. She thrived on conflict and seemed to feed off the tension she created. As the argument dragged on, the protagonist's frustration grew. They had already dealt with Karen's behavior on multiple occasions, and each encounter left them feeling drained and powerless. They reflected on the countless times Karen had complained about trivial matters, reported them to the HOA for minor infractions, or made unreasonable demands. It was exhausting to constantly navigate her unpredictable moods and aggressive behavior. Onlookers began to murmur among themselves, some sympathizing with the protagonist, others watching with a mix of amusement and disbelief. The neighborhood had seen Karen in action before, but the intensity of her yelling that day seemed particularly extreme. The protagonist could feel the eyes of their neighbors, adding pressure to the already tense situation. It was a delicate balance between maintaining dignity and protecting their own peace of mind. Karen continued her verbal attack, now raising her voice even higher. She accused the protagonist of being disrespectful and careless, using exaggerated gestures to emphasize her points. Her energy was relentless, and it seemed impossible for her to stop. The protagonist's heart pounded as they tried to navigate the confrontation without losing control. They focused on breathing, on staying calm, and on thinking strategically about how to handle the situation without escalating it further. In the midst of the chaos, a brief memory flashed through the protagonist's mind, an earlier incident when Karen had blocked their driveway, causing a minor argument. They remembered the frustration and the feeling of helplessness as they tried to reason with her. That memory reminded them of the ongoing pattern of behavior and the need to find a way to protect themselves while maintaining their composure. The sun continued to shine, indifferent to the tension below. The birds kept singing and the children's laughter carried on, creating a stark contrast to the heated argument in the driveway. It was a strange juxtaposition, highlighting how ordinary life could be disrupted by one person's need for control and aggression. The protagonist weighed their options carefully. Ignoring Karen had not worked in the past, and simply complying with her demands would only reinforce her behavior. They realized that they needed to assert themselves, to find a way to stand their ground without resorting to anger or retaliation. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience, strategy, and an understanding of human behavior. Karen's yelling began to attract more attention, drawing other neighbors closer. Some attempted to intervene, offering calming words or trying to distract her, but she seemed impervious to reason. The protagonist noticed the tension in the air, the mix of curiosity, concern, and frustration from the surrounding onlookers. It was a social pressure that added complexity to an already volatile situation. Despite the chaos, the protagonist remained focused. They understood that losing their temper would only escalate the situation further. They responded with calm, measured words, attempting to communicate that the argument was unnecessary and that the issue could be resolved peacefully. But Karen's mind seemed closed, her anger overriding any rational thought. As the confrontation continued, the protagonist felt a growing determination. They realized that this was a moment of testing, a challenge to maintain dignity in the face of aggression. They began to formulate a plan, considering ways to respond that would assert their boundaries and protect their space without causing harm. It was a mental exercise, a strategy game in real life, requiring careful thought and emotional control. Karen's intensity showed no sign of waning. She continued to shout, pointing fingers and gesturing wildly. The protagonist felt the weight of the situation pressing down, the need to act carefully while asserting themselves. It was a delicate dance of communication, patience, and resilience. The protagonist took a step back, assessing the environment and the reactions of those around them. They noticed subtle signs of support from some neighbors, a nod, a concerned look, a quiet murmur of agreement. These small gestures provided reassurance, reinforcing the idea that they were not alone in dealing with Karen's behavior. It was a reminder that community dynamics could play a role in managing conflict. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway, the confrontation showed no signs of ending. Karen's energy remained high, her voice sharp and demanding. The protagonist, however, felt a quiet strength building within. They understood that this was more than a simple argument. It was a test of character, patience, and resolve. In that moment, the protagonist made a silent decision. They would not be intimidated or manipulated. They would stand firm, protect their space, and find a way to resolve the situation on their own terms. It was a turning point, a moment of internal empowerment that contrasted sharply with the external chaos. The tension remained thick in the air, but the protagonist's mind was clear. They were determined to navigate the confrontation with intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking. Karen's yelling could not control their emotions or dictate their actions. It was a battle of wills, one that required careful planning, emotional resilience, and a steady hand. As the afternoon faded into evening, the confrontation lingered, unresolved but marked by the protagonist's growing resolve. They had survived the initial onslaught, maintained their composure, and begun to consider the next steps. It was a critical first part of a larger story, a moment that would shape the events to come and test the limits of patience, strategy, and human resilience. In the quiet moments after Karen stormed off briefly, muttering under her breath, the protagonist reflected on the experience. They understood that living next to someone like Karen required constant vigilance, emotional control, and strategic thinking. But they also recognized that moments like these offered opportunities to grow stronger, more assertive, and more capable of handling conflict without losing their humanity. The day ended with a mix of exhaustion and quiet determination. The protagonist knew that this was only the beginning, that the challenges with Karen were far from over. But they also knew that they had the strength and... After the confrontation that afternoon, the protagonist felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because Karen had eventually stormed off, her loud voice fading into the distance, and unease because they knew this was far from over. Karen had a way of making small disputes feel larger than life, and the protagonist understood that the tension could return at any time. Sitting on their porch, they tried to unwind, sipping a glass of water and letting the cool breeze calm their racing thoughts. Yet the memories of Karen's harsh words replayed in their mind, a stubborn echo that refused to fade. The protagonist reflected on the past weeks, remembering every encounter that had tested their patience. Karen had a reputation for escalating minor issues, complaints about parking, the way mail was delivered, or even the position of trash bins. Each time she demanded immediate correction, often in a tone that felt aggressive and unfair. The protagonist had tried to navigate these conflicts carefully, always aiming to remain calm, polite, and patient. But the constant pressure was beginning to wear them down. They remembered the first time they had truly felt the weight of Karen's aggression. It was over something trivial, a small misunderstanding about a shared driveway. The argument had quickly escalated, and the protagonist had felt cornered, unsure of how to respond. At that moment, they had learned that reasoning with Karen often did little to change her behavior. Over time, the protagonist had developed strategies to manage her outbursts, learning to stay calm and assert boundaries without escalating the conflict further. On this particular evening, after Karen had left, the protagonist decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The streets were quiet and the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Walking helped them clear their mind, to think through the confrontation and consider how best to approach future encounters. They knew that ignoring Karen had only worked temporarily, and complying with every demand would only encourage her. A balance had to be found, a way to protect their space, assert themselves, and still remain reasonable. As they walked, the protagonist noticed subtle signs of the neighborhood's awareness of the ongoing tension. Neighbors waved politely, some offering sympathetic smiles, while others seemed to watch from a distance, unsure how to respond. The protagonist understood that this was a delicate situation, one that required careful navigation of both human emotions and social dynamics. They also recognized the importance of keeping their own integrity intact, refusing to let Karen's behavior dictate their actions completely. Returning home, the protagonist spent the evening reflecting on potential solutions. They considered setting clear boundaries, documenting incidents, and even seeking advice from community resources. Each idea came with its own challenges, but the protagonist was determined to find a path that maintained their dignity while protecting their space. They knew that being proactive rather than reactive would be key in handling Karen's future outbursts. The next morning brought a new wave of tension. Karen had apparently taken offense to something minor from the day before, and her presence was felt even before she arrived. The protagonist noticed her standing across the street, arms crossed, watching them with a critical gaze. Her expression was sharp, and it was clear that she was already preparing for another confrontation. The protagonist felt a familiar mix of anxiety and determination, knowing that this encounter would test their patience and strategy once more. Karen approached, her footsteps deliberate and heavy, as if she wanted to make her presence felt with every step. She launched immediately into complaints, her voice loud and demanding. This time it was about something even more minor, the placement of garden decorations, a situation that in any other context would be considered trivial. The protagonist listened carefully, nodding occasionally, responding with calm, measured words. They had learned that reacting impulsively would only give Karen more power. Despite the protagonist's composed demeanor, Karen's intensity was relentless. She gestured wildly, her voice rising and falling with her emotional peaks. It was exhausting to maintain composure in the face of such aggression. Yet the protagonist focused on deep breathing, keeping their mind clear and choosing words carefully. Each response was deliberate, aiming to assert boundaries while avoiding provocation. Neighbors began to notice the interaction again. Some looked on with concern, while others whispered among themselves. The protagonist felt the subtle weight of social observation, recognizing that how they handled the situation could influence not only their own life, but also the perception of others. It added another layer of complexity, a reminder that human interactions were never just about the immediate conflict. They were also about relationships, reputation, and community dynamics. As the confrontation continued, the protagonist's mind shifted to strategy. They thought about ways to prevent future incidents, to minimize the stress caused by Karen's behavior. Documenting events became a priority, noting dates, times, and specific actions. This would not only help in any potential mediation, but also serve as a mental record, a tool for maintaining clarity and perspective. They realized that preparation was a powerful form of empowerment. Karen, oblivious to the protagonist's internal planning, continued her verbal assault. She criticized, accused, and demanded attention, seemingly intent on drawing out as much frustration as possible. The protagonist responded with calm firmness, repeating key points and setting clear boundaries. They reminded Karen politely but firmly that certain behaviors were unacceptable and that minor disagreements could be resolved without yelling or personal attacks. The tension began to shift subtly. Karen's energy remained high, but the protagonist's consistent calmness created an unexpected dynamic. The confrontation was no longer a one-sided barrage. It was beginning to reflect the protagonist's ability to control their own reactions. This realization strengthened their confidence, showing that even in the face of persistent aggression, maintaining composure could influence the outcome. Later that afternoon, the protagonist considered seeking support from others in the neighborhood. They spoke quietly with a few trusted neighbors, explaining the situation and asking for advice. Some shared similar experiences, offering empathy and practical suggestions. Others encouraged documenting incidents and, if necessary, involving the HOA to mediate recurring conflicts. The protagonist absorbed this advice, feeling a sense of community support that had been missing during the initial confrontations. Throughout the day, the protagonist also reflected on their own emotional responses. They acknowledged feelings of anger, frustration, and stress without letting them dictate their behavior. This self-awareness was crucial, allowing them to navigate the conflict with intelligence and patience. They understood that human emotions were natural and valid, but acting impulsively could lead to undesirable consequences. Evenings became a time of preparation and reflection. The protagonist began to visualize potential future interactions with Karen, considering different approaches and responses. They mentally rehearsed scenarios, imagining calm, confident, and assertive ways to handle verbal attacks. This exercise helped reduce anxiety, build resilience, and provide a sense of control over situations that previously felt unpredictable. The protagonist also found ways to manage stress outside of interactions with Karen. They engaged in small, grounding activities, reading, walking, and spending time in quiet reflection. These moments provided balance, preventing the constant tension from overwhelming their daily life. They realized that maintaining personal well-being was essential, not just for handling conflicts, but for overall happiness and peace of mind. As days passed, the pattern of encounters with Karen became clearer. The protagonist began to anticipate her behavior, recognizing early signs of potential conflicts. This foresight allowed them to prepare mentally and emotionally, reducing the element of surprise that had previously caused stress. They learned that observation, patience, and strategic thinking were powerful tools in managing challenging relationships. The protagonist also considered long-term solutions. They thought about communication strategies, documenting patterns, and setting firm boundaries. They explored ways to involve community resources if necessary, ensuring that the conflict did not escalate beyond manageable levels. Each step was deliberate, reflecting a careful balance between assertiveness and caution. Throughout this period, the protagonist's perspective shifted subtly. They began to see the encounters not just as stressful events, but as opportunities for personal growth. The challenges required patience, emotional intelligence, and strategic thinking, skills that could be applied in many areas of life. The experience, while difficult, became a lesson in resilience, self-control, and human dynamics. Even as Karen continued her unpredictable behavior, the protagonist felt a growing sense of empowerment. They understood that while they could not control Karen, they could control their own responses. This realization brought a quiet confidence, a feeling that they could navigate even the most challenging interactions with dignity and composure. The protagonist's journey through these encounters was far from over. Each day presented new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn and grow. They approached each situation with care. Days passed, and the protagonist could feel the tension with Karen reaching a new level. The previous encounters had left them exhausted, but also more determined to take control of the situation. They had realized that passive patience alone was no longer enough. Something had to change if they wanted to protect their space, maintain peace of mind, and stop Karen from constantly intruding into their life. The morning began quietly. Birds sang, and the sunlight spilled across the quiet neighborhood. Yet the protagonist's mind was restless, focused on the challenge that lay ahead. They knew that Karen could appear at any time, ready to criticize or provoke. Each step outside the house became a careful decision, an assessment of potential interactions. The protagonist had learned to read Karen's body language, recognizing the subtle signals that indicated she was preparing to escalate. That day, the protagonist had a plan. They were not going to react impulsively. Instead, they would assert themselves in a controlled, strategic way. They had been documenting every incident, noting dates, times, and exact words. This record gave them confidence, a mental shield against any manipulation or false claims. They understood the power of preparation, and this time they intended to use it. Karen arrived as if she could sense the protagonist's readiness. She marched across the lawn, hands on her hips, eyes sharp and accusing. Her voice rang out immediately, criticizing the way the protagonist had arranged the outdoor furniture, claiming it was an eyesore. The protagonist listened calmly, responding with steady, polite words, acknowledging the complaint but refusing to concede to irrational demands. They emphasized that their space was their own, and that minor differences in arrangement did not warrant such aggression. Karen was unrelenting. She raised her voice, gesturing wildly, trying to provoke a reaction. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some whispering in concern, others watching in quiet curiosity. The protagonist could feel the weight of observation, but they remained calm. They had rehearsed these moments in their mind, visualizing their responses, and now the training paid off. They spoke slowly, clearly, asserting boundaries without resorting to anger. Despite the protagonist's calm demeanor, frustration simmered beneath the surface. The intensity of Karen's behavior was draining, and every word seemed designed to push buttons. The protagonist focused on their breathing, allowing thoughts of patience and strategy to outweigh impulses of retaliation. They reminded themselves that every word spoken in anger could worsen the situation, and that careful control was the path to empowerment. As the confrontation continued, the protagonist began to notice a shift. Karen's energy, though high, seemed to lack the control that she wielded in previous encounters. The protagonist's consistent calmness created a subtle change in the dynamic. This realization gave them a sense of inner strength, a feeling that they could influence the interaction simply by controlling their own behavior. During a brief pause in Karen's shouting, the protagonist took the opportunity to set clear boundaries. They calmly explained that yelling and personal attacks were unacceptable, and that they preferred disputes to be handled respectfully. Karen, taken aback by the firmness and clarity, paused, searching for a response. This moment of hesitation was brief but significant. It revealed that even Karen could be confronted without escalating chaos, as long as the approach was strategic and composed. The protagonist then considered the practical aspects of handling the situation. They had learned from past encounters that Karen could return at any time, often unannounced and unpredictable. To prepare, they reinforced the physical boundaries of their property, ensuring that gates and locks were secure. They arranged their environment in a way that minimized opportunities for confrontation, while allowing them to respond effectively if needed. This practical foresight became a tool for psychological empowerment. Throughout the day, the protagonist reflected on the emotions involved in dealing with Karen. They acknowledged feelings of anger, irritation, and stress, recognizing that these emotions were valid but needed careful management. Rather than suppressing feelings, they used self-awareness to guide their actions, channeling emotional energy into calm, deliberate responses. This approach allowed them to maintain control, even in the face of persistent provocation. Neighbors continued to watch from a distance, some offering silent support, others simply observing. The protagonist understood that the social dynamics added complexity, but also offered subtle reinforcement. Community awareness could serve as both a protective factor and a motivating element. They were no longer facing Karen's aggression in isolation. The subtle acknowledgement from others provided quiet validation of their approach. Karen, growing frustrated by the lack of an angry reaction, began to escalate in a different way. She attempted to assert dominance through intimidation, stepping closer, waving her arms and emphasizing every word. The protagonist did not flinch. They maintained distance, eye contact, and a composed voice projecting calm authority. This change in posture and attitude subtly undermined Karen's usual tactics, reducing her control over the interaction. During this exchange, the protagonist began to plan for future encounters. They considered long-term strategies to prevent repeated harassment, including involving neighborhood associations or mediation services if necessary. They also planned personal routines to maintain emotional balance, such as journaling, meditation, and seeking supportive conversations with trusted neighbors. These proactive steps created a sense of control that was empowering and sustainable. As the afternoon unfolded, Karen's energy began to wane, partly due to the lack of an emotional reaction from the protagonist. Her shouts became less frequent, her gestures less exaggerated. The protagonist recognized the subtle victory, a result of patience, strategic thinking, and calm assertiveness. They understood that controlling one's own behavior could influence even the most aggressive individuals, and that inner strength often outweighed outward confrontation. By evening, the protagonist felt a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. The day had tested their resilience, patience, and strategic thinking, but they had managed to maintain control and assert boundaries effectively. They reflected on the lessons learned, recognizing that human behavior could be managed with intelligence and awareness, even when faced with persistent provocation. In quiet moments of reflection, the protagonist considered the psychological impact of repeated confrontations. They realized that dealing with aggressive individuals like Karen required not only tactical responses but also emotional resilience. By maintaining calm, documenting incidents, and planning ahead, they could reduce stress, maintain dignity, and protect their personal space without resorting to retaliation. The protagonist also explored creative ways to manage stress and maintain balance. They spent time on hobbies, engaged in outdoor activities, and nurtured positive relationships with neighbors who offered understanding and support. These efforts provided emotional stability, reducing the impact of Karen's aggression, and allowing the protagonist to approach conflicts with clarity and composure. As the sun set and shadows stretched across the neighborhood, the protagonist prepared for the possibility of future encounters. They reinforced their mental strategies, visualizing calm and assertive responses. They also strengthened physical boundaries and developed contingency plans for unexpected situations. This preparation provided a sense of empowerment, turning anxiety into confidence and uncertainty into readiness. The protagonist's understanding of Karen's behavior deepened. They recognized patterns of provocation, triggers for aggression, and methods of intimidation. With this insight, they could anticipate potential conflicts and respond strategically. This awareness transformed the relationship from one of reactive stress to proactive management, creating a sense of control that had previously been absent. Throughout this period, the protagonist maintained a focus on personal growth. They reflected on the importance of patience, emotional intelligence, and strategic thinking. Each encounter with Karen became an opportunity to develop resilience, strengthen boundaries, and practice effective communication. The challenges, while difficult, were shaping the protagonist into a more confident and composed individual. By the end of Part 3, the protagonist had established a solid foundation for handling the ongoing conflict. They had demonstrated that calm assertiveness, strategic planning, and emotional awareness could influence even the most persistent provocations. The story was far from over, but the protagonist had reached a pivotal point, empowered, prepared, and ready to face whatever challenges Karen might present next. The lessons learned from these encounters would guide them through the remaining chapters, shaping not only their interactions with Karen, but also their approach to future challenges in life. The days following the previous confrontation brought a different kind of tension. The protagonist was aware that Karen was watching, planning, and waiting for the right moment to escalate the situation again. But the protagonist had changed. They had grown calmer, more strategic, and more confident in managing her behavior. They knew the key to surviving and even influencing these encounters lay in patience, preparation, and self-control. That morning, the protagonist went about their routine with a heightened awareness. Every step outside the house was measured, every movement intentional. Karen could appear at any time, ready to provoke or criticize, so the protagonist was prepared. Their mind replayed possible scenarios, considering Karen's typical patterns, predicting her reactions, and planning responses that would assert boundaries without escalating conflict. They had learned that anticipation was as important as reaction. When Karen finally appeared, she was more aggressive than usual. Her face was set in a scowl, her arms crossed tightly, and her tone sharp and commanding. She immediately began complaining about a trivial issue, the way the protagonist had parked their car the night before. Normally, this would be a minor irritation, but with Karen, every small action became an opportunity for conflict. The protagonist remained calm, listening patiently and responding with measured words, explaining their reasoning without apologizing unnecessarily. Karen grew frustrated at the lack of an emotional reaction. Her gestures became larger, and her voice rose, trying to force an argument. The protagonist maintained composure, focusing on clear, calm communication. They were aware of the power of self-control, understanding that Karen's aggression only had influence if met with panic or anger. By staying grounded, they began to regain a sense of control in an otherwise chaotic interaction. Neighbors noticed the ongoing tension, some whispering in concern, others silently observing. The protagonist felt the subtle weight of these observations, knowing that their behavior was being watched. This awareness added another layer of responsibility, but also provided quiet reinforcement. Each calm response, each measured word, demonstrated not only control but also strength, and the protagonist felt a growing sense of empowerment. The confrontation escalated further as Karen accused the protagonist of being disrespectful and uncooperative. Her voice carried across the street, drawing attention and increasing the pressure. The protagonist listened carefully, acknowledging her complaints without giving in to provocation. They reiterated boundaries and calmly explained acceptable ways to handle disagreements. Karen's face reflected disbelief. She had expected a different reaction, but the protagonist's calm defiance unsettled her. Throughout the day, the protagonist continued to manage the situation strategically. They had learned to anticipate Karen's tactics and prepare for each encounter. They made sure gates and doors were secure, minimized opportunities for unnecessary interaction, and planned verbal responses in advance. These small preparations provided peace of mind and a sense of control, reducing the unpredictability that had caused stress in previous confrontations. As Karen's yelling continued, the protagonist remained calm, letting her words pass without internalizing them. They reflected on previous experiences, using lessons learned to maintain composure. They reminded themselves that Karen's aggression was a reflection of her own issues and not a personal attack. This mental distance allowed the protagonist to respond with clarity and assertiveness rather than emotion. During a brief pause, the protagonist spoke firmly but politely, outlining the boundaries once more. They explained that yelling and personal attacks were unacceptable and that future disagreements should be handled respectfully. Karen's reaction was a mixture of shock and anger, but the protagonist remained steady. This moment was a small victory, demonstrating that calm, strategic communication could influence even the most aggressive behavior. The protagonist also sought support from neighbors they trusted. They shared the ongoing challenges and received advice, reassurance, and understanding. Some neighbors had faced similar situations and offered practical suggestions, while others provided emotional support. This sense of community helped the protagonist feel less isolated and more capable of handling future encounters. Throughout the afternoon, the protagonist focused on emotional regulation. They recognized feelings of anger, frustration, and stress, but chose not to act impulsively. Instead, they used techniques like deep breathing, visualization, and mental rehearsal to maintain calm. This self-awareness and emotional control were critical in managing interactions with Karen effectively and safely. Karen's intensity began to ebb slightly as the day went on. The protagonist's consistent calmness combined with clear boundaries began to influence her behavior. She seemed momentarily unsure of how to proceed, which allowed the protagonist to assert more control over the situation. It was a subtle but significant shift, showing that patience and strategy could alter the dynamics of even the most challenging interactions. As evening approached, the protagonist reflected on the lessons of the day. They had learned the importance of preparation, emotional control, and strategic thinking. They recognized that confrontation with aggressive individuals required both mental and practical planning. By anticipating behavior, maintaining composure, and setting boundaries, they could navigate conflicts without succumbing to stress or anger. The protagonist also considered long-term strategies for maintaining peace. They planned to document incidents meticulously, creating a record that could be useful if the situation escalated further. They explored ways to engage community resources or mediation if necessary. Each step was designed to protect their personal space and ensure that future interactions could be handled calmly and effectively. In quiet moments of reflection, the protagonist recognized the personal growth that had come from these challenges. They had become more resilient, patient, and strategic. They had learned to separate their emotions from the conflict, allowing for clear thinking and effective responses. These skills extended beyond interactions with Karen, providing tools for handling difficult situations in all areas of life. By the end of the day, the protagonist felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. They had faced intense provocation without losing control, asserted their boundaries, and maintained dignity. The ongoing tension with Karen had not disappeared, but the protagonist had gained confidence and clarity. They were prepared for future encounters, knowing that calm, strategic action could influence even the most aggressive behavior. The protagonist's journey through these encounters had transformed them. They were no longer simply reacting to Karen's aggression. They were managing it with intelligence, patience, and strategy. Each confrontation was a test of resilience and self-control, and the protagonist was learning to navigate it with skill. They understood that human behavior could be challenging, but with preparation and awareness it could be managed. The day closed with the protagonist feeling empowered and prepared. Karen remained unpredictable, but the protagonist had developed the tools to handle her behavior effectively. They had learned the importance of setting boundaries, maintaining emotional control, and planning strategically. These lessons would guide them through the remaining encounters, ensuring that they could maintain peace, dignity, and personal integrity.